Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Now, our guest today is an orthopedic surgeon from Tasmania with 30 plus years of experience. And he'll correct me on that if I'm wrong. He is the author of Inversion, One Man's Answer for World Peace and Global Health. He's a cancer survivor, and he has a personal story, which we're going to start with and then discuss fructose, mainly fructose metabolism and other related topics. Dr. Gary Fettke, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Thank you very much. Well, hi, Nayiri. You actually asked for the personal story. Well, you forgot to mention I'm happily married to Belinda Fettke.
Well, so, I think my audience already knows that because I've interviewed Belinda.
I know that, but it's important that you actually wanted the story. So, I mean, we're actually part of a team. We've been married for, well, more than 35 years. Well, I got 40 years coming up, so that's pretty close. We're part of each other's story, and I think you reflected on that already. So, that's it.
I love that.
Okay, we can go now.
That's how we're going to start the interview. I love that. I love that commentary. Thank you so much. Okay, so for those of you who watched my interview with Belinda, she talked in detail about how she supported her husband when you got into trouble. I'd like you to hear the same story from the man himself, from Dr. Gary Fettke, how he got into trouble at the hospital where he was working and operating on amputating diabetic people's legs over and over again. And he decided one day to tell them, hey, lower your carbohydrates. It might actually save your next leg. And he got into trouble for it. They tried to silence him. They cautioned him. I'd like you, Dr. Fettke, to tell my audience who was trying to stop you from giving nutrition advice that didn't agree with their principles, and what was their motivating factor?
Well, first of all, I thought it was a joke. I honestly did not take it seriously because I was talking about preventative health, and we've been battling as a society the perils of metabolic health, obesity, diabetes, and they're only getting worse and worse. And the latest figure is 93.2% of the population have poor metabolic health. That's it. So less than 7% of the population. It's US data, but nonetheless, you can extrapolate it into the UK, into Australia, New Zealand. Most Western societies and most developing nations have got similar metabolic health issues. And the long and the short of it is, for the last 20 years at least, I've been considering what fuel you put into your body is actually more important than what you do with your body. So it's no use taking your car into the repair shop if you've been putting the wrong petrol in. First of all, fix the fuel, fix the petrol, and then work out where it goes. So orthopedic surgeons are very practical and looking for a root cause. So I mean, we've been band-aiding sick care for 100 years, I'll argue, but in this instance, the complications of obesity, and particularly diabetes, and particularly in my practice, it became pretty obvious when I'm actually got patients in unstable diabetes in hospital, looking at amputating their legs, toes, cleaning things up, infections out of control, and they're being given ice cream 3 times a day. That was the turning point for me, and I said, "This is crazy. Would you stop doing that?" And they said, "No, that's the hospital guidelines. That's what we're supposed to feed them." And I said, "No." And then that started my journey down the path of my own personal health, when I started realizing the central role of sugar at that time. But originally, as it's turned out, it's actually carbohydrate, insulin, growth factors, the overall combination, what I call it, fructose, refined carbohydrate, and polyunsaturated oil. So my crime was to try and work out the root cause of our metabolic health issues. And I'm very proud that in that modern era, I'm the first person to actually put together that combination of fructose, refined carbohydrate, polyunsaturated oils. I can remember the jigsaw puzzle coming together. Lots of people are talking about it now, but I can tell you, it was completely uncharted territory, 2012, 2013. It was a real light bulb moments, and I started talking about that. Anyway, before that, I started talking about sugar and the perils of that, then polyunsaturated seed oils, and then refined carbohydrate, that whole combo. But the problem was Belinda and said, look, this is really important. You seem to have got a lot worked out. You should get on this thing called social media. And I said, I'm not going to get on social media. I can still remember the lounge in San Francisco. It wasn't actually a lounge. We were just in transit, and there was a little kiosk cafeteria there. And Belinda and our daughter put me on this thing called Facebook. I don't know if any of you have heard about it. And within 24 hours, I was being trolled by someone who worked for Coca-Cola. I launched a website in a similar time frame, and again, it just came at me. The system did not like an orthopedic surgeon talking about the perils of sugar. And at that time frame, there were a few people in the media, celebrity chefs, journalists that were starting to talk about it, but it had a different meaning when a surgeon said, stop eating sugar because I don't want to chop your leg off. And I didn't realize how powerful a message that was. But in a nutshell, I was challenging the hospital food guidelines. I was challenging the national food guidelines. And in my hospital, the dietitians didn't like that. I went to them. Originally, I went to them. I said, hang on, this is really interesting stuff. What do you think? I honestly went to them with articles, and they just dismissed it all. I gave a medical grand round as a surgeon. Never happens. You know, once in 30 years, a surgeon gives a medical grand round to the physicians on fructose metabolism. They were interested, but I could not get the dietitians, who were the ones prescribing food for the patients in the hospital. I couldn't get them across the line. But I could see the results for my patients. I was on social media, and I was challenging the hospital, and it wasn't long before the dietitians were complaining about that. But as it turned out, in the same time frame, this took years to work out, Belinda came across documents that from the breakfast cereal industry saying that cereal sales were down, and the concepts of low carb, paleo, now we call it keto as well, were to blame for the cereal sales being down in Australia and New Zealand, and extrapolate that to the UK and the US. But it had there that these 7 people were to be targeted, and I was the only Australian doctor on that list for targeting. Now, you introduced us from, I'm someone from Tasmania, but I think most people don't even know where Tasmania is. A little island at the bottom end of Australia. It often gets left off of even our own cultural maps. So we're not actually, this is a small place. But the fact is the system decided to shut down this message because we were on social media. But the more it happened, and so the cereal industry were in fact then involved in paying the Dietitians Association here in Australia to promote and protect the benefits of cereal and sugar to the Australian population. The benefits of cereal and sugar. And we've got their contractual agreement, we've got the receipts, that they were being paid to literally do that. They were, in the same time frame, the dietitians are the ones helping write the national dietary guidelines, and they're the ones determining hospital food. So hospital food is actually being determined by the cereal industry for their shelf life profitability, and it's certainly not there for health. I mean, that's the trouble. You look at hospital food, it is not nutrient complete. It's high in sugars, high in carbohydrate, industrial seed oils, and it does not have a complete nutritional profile. And when I started challenging it, and when we started measuring it with a medical student, then I was taking all of that stuff with the photographs and the menu. The medical administration completely shut it down because they didn't want me to find out how nutritionally depleted it was. But what data I did get was about a week's worth of hospital food, and it was nutritionally incomplete. And most people who've been to hospital, they've got to look at hospital food and know that it's lousy.
It's carbs.
But it's also, it doesn't have complete proteins and healthy fats. And so what I was trying to do, it was to introduce for my patients with type 2 diabetes in particular, I had to prescribe on their medical chart that I wanted them to have 2 eggs a day and cheese. I had to write it on the medical chart. They wouldn't serve it to them. And what I was trying to introduce, and this is incredibly radical, I was trying to introduce the option of eggs, cheese, and a full-fat yogurt, rather than a low-fat yogurt which was full of sugar. I mean, and so therefore I was considered to be dangerous, a threat to the system. I was reported to the medical board on 3 occasions. One of those occasions was because I inappropriately reversed someone's type 2 diabetes. But by this time, I did that on national TV. So, excuse me, my patient beat Michael Mosley's patient, and both of our patients smashed the dietitian's patient. I mean, it's so easy to put type 2 diabetes into remission if you've got a committed patient and you give them the support and the accountability and the motivation, and you give them the tools, then we can do it. So as it turns out, we can drift down all that path. My scientific knowledge, my nutritional knowledge, I'll have to admit, was the standard of most doctors at the beginning of this. But now I've done pretty well a PhD in it, and I've literally, I mean, you can't really see it in the back of the study there. I'm actually trying to clean out some of the papers, but I've got, a couple of thousand papers on this, reflecting on it when I was putting the jigsaw puzzle together 10, 15, 12 years ago. So it's been an interesting journey, but I think we've now got a lot of the jigsaw puzzle worked out. And it goes against contemporary advice and contemporary guidelines, because the guidelines have not been written in the element of science. And that's where Belinda's work came in. Mm-hmm. She said, you guys are going blue in the face, talking about the science and the benefits of reducing sugar, carbs, and processed food. And you're talking about the benefits of ketosis and whether or not it's an anti-inflammatory aspect or an anti-tumor aspect or a diabetes reversal, but most of all an anti-inflammatory effect, which crosses all health boundaries, including mental health. You guys, you seem to be, she loves me, and she said, okay, you and everyone else, you seem to know what you're talking about, but you're getting hammered. So her work, she said, well, actually, if you're talking about the science, what is against that message? And therefore, not surprisingly, as it turns out, it is big food, highly processed food industry. It is the pharmaceutical industry, particularly in this situation, those involved in anti-diabetic drugs. It's worth billions. People involved now against the obesity epidemic, which is again pharma. Oh, here's a little side, message. If you hear the term fat shaming, Linda uncovered this not that long ago. Have you heard fat shaming? You're not allowed to fat shame anyone?
Yeah, it's all over.
Right.
Yeah.
It's all over the place. Do not fat shame anyone. That term is now effectively being marketed by Novo Nordisk. So Novo Nordisk is a pharmaceutical company heavily involved in anti-diabetes and anti-obesity drugs. And if they can convert the term obesity into a disease, then the commercial validation of that is that all of those drugs that they have ready to go to market, they're already using, but people are out of pocket for it, then become funded by governments. And so therefore, this term, when you hear fat shaming, I just go, fat shaming, oh, Novo Nordisk. Do you realise that this term, which is being pushed subconsciously, consciously upon healthcare professionals, oh, you're not allowed to fat shame, we've got to look at how we can treat them. No, we've got to forget that. We've got to learn how we can empower those people so they can take back control of their life. Whoa, you're not allowed to empower patients. That's the thing. We've been educated for 100 years, and that goes back to the Flexner report. It's all there in history. In 1910, the Flexner report, commissioned by Carnegie of steel and Rockefeller of oil, to take away holistic health, and that was the birth of the pharmaceutical industry. So my education, most healthcare professionals' educations, has been hijacked by the pharmaceutical industry for 100 years. All of our textbooks have got this lean towards to medicate and to operate, not to empower.
So, Dr. Fettke, who writes medical textbooks or the dietitian's textbooks? Who's writing those textbooks? Who are influencing them?
So we've got the pharmaceutical. I mean, there are 3 groups. you've got the big food, which are protecting their corporate profits. They're clearly there because the shelf life of carbohydrate is long. The shelf life of plant-based products is long. The shelf life of industrial seed oils is long. The shelf life of animal-based products is short, often require refrigeration or short handling periods because they've got they don't have high amounts of fiber in them, and they're often more in a fluid state, and therefore they need to be refrigerated, or at least a semi-solid rather than a dried out formula. So therefore, big food's there, big pharma as well. But as it turns out, religion forms into that equation, and that was really. So we honestly thought at the beginning of all this, when I'm being targeted, oh, that's the sugar industry. Well, as it turned out, it was the cereal industry, but they're hand in hand. And Belinda's work was, we couldn't work out why. Again, I'm just a humble. I mean, most people don't think orthopedic surgeons are humble, but I'm just a little guy in Tasmania, and they came out with one of the world's biggest experts on nutrition, a professor, Mark Walquist, to smash me down, to say, I'm completely out of my league, I'm not allowed to be talking about it. And the medical board listened to him. So Belinda tried to reach out to him, going, oh, hang on, this guy seems all right on paper. What he failed to declare, well, he was actually at the same time working for the cereal industry and continues to. And so she, in her research, found out he actually worked specifically for a cereal industry called Sanitarium, which is wholly owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so when you go backwards with all of this and you look at history, you realise that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is been completely behind our food pyramids, our dietary food guidelines for the Western world, and as a result has influenced where we are today. Now, I'll argue that if you eat by the food pyramid, you will die by the food pyramid, and along the way you'll look like the food pyramid, that triangle, which is harsh, but the fact is that food pyramid has been completely manipulated and it's a complete failure. So we've actually done what the food pyramid suggests. If you look at US data over the last 45 years, it's good data. We have increased our fruit and vegetable intake. We've increased our cereals and grains. We've reduced our meat consumption, particularly our red meat consumption, and we've increased our nuts and alternate proteins. We've got good data, yet our obesity epidemic's gone out of control. And so very clearly, if you look at the dietary guidelines, people say, oh, we've got an obesity epidemic because people aren't doing it. Well, we are doing it. And when you actually look at who's written the dietary guidelines, and Belinda and my work will actually show that evolution of the dietary guidelines. If you go back 100 years, it was meat and dairy, eggs, cheese, and a little bit of bread. But what we've now seen is a complete turnaround. That's in some of our lectures, the evolution of the dietary guidelines. That's Belinda's work. Mine, I've got a talk on this called The Failure of Medical Education. I've got one on central role of nutrition and everything, where we talk about this pathway. And effectively, it's all been made up. And if you track it down, it's actually based on the work of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And people say, who are the Seventh-day Adventist Church? They're small. There's only about 20 million of them around the world, 21 or so. It's hard to work it out, but that's their annual reports. They are the second biggest educator in the world after the Catholic Church. They effectively own enormous numbers of schools, primary schools, secondary schools, tertiary education centres. They own multiple hospitals in the US. They own hundreds of television stations, thousands of radio stations, 2 billion, I think, podcasts in 2020, all pushing a plant-based agenda, because their aim is they believe in the demonisation of meat. And Belinda talks about this, and effectively, meat causes, first of all, masturbation, meat causes cancer, meat causes heart disease, now meat causes environmental damage. All of this is completely made up, and it's made up based on a religious ideology that believes that if they eat a plant-based diet, then they won't masturbate, and therefore the likelihood is they'll go to heaven. But if they can convert the world to veganism along the way, this plant-based agenda, then Christ will return. Now, all of this seems completely bizarre, and I accept that it seems completely bizarre and nonsensical. But the trouble is, they have been writing the dietary guidelines since 1917. So the American Dietetics Association was formed in October 23, 1917. The founder of that was a woman by the name of Lena Cooper, first dietitian for the Defence Forces in the US, wrote the textbooks for the dietitians associations of the Western world for the next 40 years. And she was a protege of John Harvey Kellogg, who was Seventh-day Adventist, inventor of the Kellogg's cornflakes, inventor of the modern hospital. He was quite a brilliant man. You know, that whole Battle Creek Sanitarium formed the basis of every big hospital you see now. High-rise, multiple specialists, lots of beds, lots of specialties coming into the one environment and for good healthcare. But the trouble is, they got off on the wrong foot. It was all about cleansing and a lot of bowel washouts and water enemas and this dull food called breakfast cereal to quell lustful thoughts as part of this cleansing mechanism, because animal foods created lust and greed and violence and cancer. But it was more probably cancer of the soul, but it's morphed into cancer of the body now. And again, it's when you realize that they started writing the dietary guidelines, they then did research to prove the visions of their prophetess, Ellen G. White, in the 1950s. And then that's extrapolated into the Adventist health studies, which have quoted over and over and over for their health benefit. But they literally are just made up. And they take out the factors that might be just as important, which is clean living, not smoking, avoiding alcohol, that whole role of community. And they also misquote themselves. So what's your definition of veganism, to be a vegan, Nayiri? How much meat are you
Veganism
allowed to
shouldn't
eat?
include any animal products.
Mm-hmm.
But if someone is
So if
including
you're
animal products every now and again, they should be called vegan, in my opinion. They're vegetarian, which I was for 30 years until I started eating meat because I couldn't. My health was suffering.
In the Adventist health studies, you are vegetarian as long as you don't eat meat more than once a week. And you're vegan as long as you don't eat meat more than once a month. Well, it's not vegan as it's, set out to society. It's certainly not vegan as it's pushed towards avoiding all animal-based products, not even to wear leather or have anything to do with an animal-based in your cleaning products or all of that. So therefore, it's very selective. But the trouble is that's been told over and over and over again. And they say they live longer. Well, in fact, I've got literature to show that the Mormons live longer. The Ashkenawi Jews in the US live longer than the Adventists. But they've controlled the propaganda. They've controlled the message because they're educators. They're controlling the message because they've been writing the dietary guidelines for 100 years. And they repeat the message because they have this major influence on media. They're so integrated into our processed food industry. And people may disbelieve this, but effectively the Adventist Church started the cereal industry, the whole Western soy industry. They started the alternate meat industry, the stevia industry. They have got so much money. And here in Australia, they don't pay taxes on it. And their aim is to just keep this health reform message rolling over and over and over. Somewhere in the midst of it, I got caught. Tim Noakes in South Africa got caught because we're giving a message which is against this corporate model, which, as it turns out, is keeping us sick. Because look, it'd be fine if the food pyramid worked. I'd say fine, but it doesn't. And we know, particularly on a day-to-day basis, as an individual Or if I put a glucose monitor on someone who's has type 2 diabetes or is pre-diabetes, which is at least 2/3 of the population, I can show that their blood glucose spikes when they have carbohydrate. And I can show it comes down when they don't. And I can see that they can get total control. So if you've got type 2 diabetes, if you go low carb and you go hard at it with the right support, then you can go into remission within days.
Mm-hmm.
Incredibly powerful.
Yeah, well, I can relate to that as a type 1 diabetic of 44 years now, maybe even 45 now. Yeah, approaching 45 years. When I moved to the UK for 20 years, I was following the food pyramid, which is very similar in the UK. So right at the bottom, largest amount is wheat and rice and starches and bread. And then come fruits and potatoes. And I ate that diet. In fact, in my plate, I would prioritize the starches as a type 1 diabetic because that was what we were given. Just so the first thing I would think about, I'm having a meal, okay, like fill the plate with rice and match it with insulin, take insulin for it. And I knew it didn't work because my A1C was constantly high. And then I wore in 2017, I put a CGM on and I've been wearing it continuously. And then I saw the havoc it was causing on my blood sugars. I started cutting them out. Yeah, I mean, the blood sugar spike, and it's not just a one-off incident. When you have a spike, you're going to have a crash. As you're crashing, not when you have the full crash, as you're crashing, you start shaking, you start feeling dizzy, and you start craving more carbohydrate. And then, so that roller coaster all day long, every single day, it's not conducive to good health, is it? I mean,
it's
CGM,
exhausting.
I'm so grateful for it.
Well, I actually think a lot of symptoms come with that rapid rise and drop. And I've got people who don't have diabetes and they do this.
Yes.
And in fact, if I go along and give myself sugar or carbs, I gave a talk once, which not that long ago, had a CGM and I had 2 bananas at the beginning of it, so normal blood glucose. And by 20, 30 minutes later, I was in diabetes zone. I started losing my voice. And it's literally, you feel crook as a dog when, excuse the term, but literally when you're having these ups and downs, it's the body, it's this, and you know, if you've got type 1 and you've moved into this like this with your blood glucose, your life has improved immensely. I did some work with, a teenager, Ollie, I mean, because he's gone on stage with me and he went low carb, or his mum got him to go low carb as a teenager, and his school report and the teacher said, they can't believe that they've got a student. Like, he used to think, didn't think he was very smart because he couldn't concentrate at school. He literally thought, I'm not smart. And he started doubting himself, but he was doing this all the time. And literally once going low carb, he said, actually, I am smart. Well, this is a 15-year-old. It just puts it all together that, hang on, I've got control of my life again. Sure, he might get off the rails a little bit, as most 15, 16-year-olds can do, but he was able to recognise that and then his teachers and everyone around him went, hang on, he's actually a good kid. And think about how many type 1s that are out there who got poor schooling, lousy, attainment at school, lousy attendance at school, because they're doing this. And literally, and you'd be aware of the type 1 grit group. And so I'm very proudly still helped R.D. Dykeman right at the beginning of that, Jimmy Moore and myself, when he and his family were under a bit of pressure and all that sort of thing. And R.D. just, started that, and we gave him support. And they are now the best 0.1% controlled type 1s in the world. And if someone with type 1 diabetes not producing insulin, I think I've got some theories about why type 1 diabetes is increasing in society, but nonetheless, if you can get control of that by low carb, Richard Bernstein's law of small numbers. Small amounts of carbs in means lower doses of insulin, which means less highs and less lows and less roller coaster. It's such a complete no-brainer, except we've been told you've got to have your carbs. Carbs are essential. You've got to have your grains. You've got to have your fruits. And effectively, that's all just been made up.